Welcome to a very special episode of the Space Times podcast. Today, we are happy to welcome Brian Taylor, CEO and founder of Lux Aeterna, to Space Times to celebrate their $10 million Series seed raise and to talk about how they will use it to deploy their first reusable satellites. Brian, thank you so much for joining us. To start, would you mind just giving us an overview of your company? What does Lux Aeterna do and why is it needed for the space industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So first off, thanks for having me. Really happy to be on the podcast. So Lux Aeterna is building fully reusable satellites via reentry. So this gives us, down mass capability. So we're definitely, providing another solution to in-space manufacturing, hypersonics testing, and everything that kind of goes along with that, host of payload testing as a result of that. But really, we see that the platform we're building, if we do it correctly, can be made fully reusable in addition to the reentry capability. And so when it is fully reusable, now we've got a whole new way of doing space infrastructure. And we see this as a solution to supply chain resiliency, hardware reliability, and general cadence in the satellite industry as a whole. So our ambitions in the long run are so much larger than just reentry. That is the means by which we get to reuse. And we want to make that very robust and reliable and regular. But we see the reusability extending much further beyond that to the infrastructure of the future space industry and orbital logistics, both in LEO all the way to cislunar and even to Mars.
Very exciting and ambitious endeavor that we'll cheer you along for. To kind of get into the core of the idea, it to use reusability for the spacecraft, and we've seen that with Falcon 9 where you worked at SpaceX. But there's like certain levels of reusability where some things need to be refurbished, some things can fly again just the way they are. Can you kind of walk us through what level of reusability your spacecraft will have?
Yeah, so I think, like a lot of technologies that you reference, like Falcon 9, it starts in one place and has a goal to get to a more optimized place for that reusability. Um, excuse me. So, in the very beginning, after our first flight, we're going to disassemble and learn a whole bunch about the vehicle and exactly what the state is of every, component, the heat shield, the structure, the avionics, the solar array, the propulsion system, all those types of things. That will very much inform what's easy to refly and what's not easy to refly. We have a pretty good idea of what those things will be. Our first vehicles will use an ablative heat shield, which is one-time use. So that definitely gets refurbished in between each flight. But everything else on the vehicle right now is designed to be used more than once. Exactly how many times depends on the data that we get from that first flight. But the solar array, the propulsion system, the avionics, the structure, those are all designed to be reused without being replaced in between flights. And the goal is to optimize that over time as we learn more and more about the process and we get better and better about that. Our goal is to have very quick turn between flights as a result of kind of block upgrades and scaling.
And so the heat shield, you said it's ablative. Is that using like the phenolic impregnated carbon ablative, kind of state of the art?
Yep. Yeah. So we use the state of the art, which is, we've got a Space Act agreement with NASA, so we get to stand on the shoulders of giants there, and use some of the technology that they've developed. But we own the supply chain and manage the build and the assembly of all that. It's really just the expertise that we get from NASA on that.
And you kind of keeping an eye on that area of technology because SpaceX has been testing out some other technology with like metal plates and stuff. Is there anything else that's of interest to you?
Yeah, so we definitely see, a long-term need for the refurbishment cycle times that we want in a fully reusable heat shield, and we're doing that in parallel to building Delphi, our first vehicle that is ablative. We're doing that specifically for the low Earth orbit orbital regime with our use case of our vehicle. That's very different than, say, what Starship tiles have, or what, kind of specifics they're looking at SpaceX. So it's a little bit of a different thrust, but it is a development area that we're doing internally to get us to a place where we've got full and rapid reusability of the satellite.
And for some of the other components, I know, re-entry to the atmosphere is a very trying kind of part of the mission, like yours. But there's other components that suffer from, being on orbit, such as degradation of batteries and solar cells over lifetime, radiation dosage over that lifetime, atomic oxygen on your MLI. Do you have like new components that you're designing to address all of these issues, or are you able to get off the shelf components for a lot of this?
We're able to use off the shelf components for most of those and adjust the lifetimes. I think one of the paradigm shifts that we allow here is that normally when you design a solar array or an avionics box, or anything for a satellite, you're designing it for a certain lifetime. And at the end of that lifetime, you don't get to touch the satellite. You don't get to see it throughout the entire life of that component. We have the luxury of having hands on the hardware after we get it back. So we can take it to larger extremes earlier in the lifetime, and then do an acceptance test procedure or do an inspection, and actually recertify that hardware because we have our own hands on it. That really changes the risk posture with which you design components when you don't have to match the lifetimes of everything on the spacecraft to be, say, 5 years. You can have something that is relatively cheap that's good for 5 to 7 years, but you can go cheaper on one component or lower cost on one component because you're going to get it back within a year and you can replace that if you need to. But it really changes the risk posture to failure analyses, especially when it comes to things that happen during reentry. So, like reaction wheels, for example, are not used during reentry. We can allow those to get pretty hot, much hotter than we would on orbit when we need to make sure that they're going to work the entire time. Because if they do get a little bit hotter during reentry, then we're going to be able to have hands on that hardware, run it through an acceptance test procedure, take it apart if we need to. That's a very different situation than ensuring something never goes above its operational qualification limit while it's on orbit.
And what kind of lifetime are you looking at over the course of multiple missions? Because and how does that change based upon the orbital domains that you're going to? Because you talked about lunar as well, and we know LEO is like 5 years, GEO is 15 years.
Yeah.
What are the kind of lifetime breakdowns there?
Yeah, so I'll just comment on low Earth orbit right now, which is kind of where we'll be hanging out for the foreseeable future. So our next generation vehicle, our production vehicle, is being designed for 15 years in orbit, or cumulative time in orbit, or 15 re-entry cycles, whichever one of those comes first. So we can do 15 1-month missions with that vehicle, and there's some refurbishment kind of along the way. Or we could do, 3 5-year missions for a total of 15 years. And the way that we see it is, if you separate the vehicle bus from the payload, the technology on the satellite itself is not actually changing and innovating that rapidly, right? The solar arrays that we're using this year are pretty close to the solar arrays we were using 5 years ago. There's a little bit of difference to go for terrestrial based solar cells and silicon, but in general, they're not innovating that much. Now, the technology on, say, hyperspectral cameras is moving much, much faster, right? So if you separate the satellite bus from the payload itself, and you say, let's keep the satellite bus constant and reuse that, you're really not missing out on a bunch of technology innovation by doing that. You're just saving a whole bunch of money by not rebuilding the satellite every time. But you can now run 1-year missions where you get the latest technology on the satellite payload, right? So hyperspectral camera or communications or in space manufacturing, whatever that may be. So
That actually brings up an interesting point that I wanted to ask about is how do you handle block upgrades? You have a spacecraft, do you swap out the components or do you just create a new line and say, this is the old Civic that you can fly and have this new shiny one on the other side?
Yeah, I mean, so our long-term vision, which we don't think is too far away, say maybe 2030, is that we have a fleet of satellites that are moving up and down on a regular basis. By 2030, we expect to have 40 missions in a year. Those vehicles are going to be of varying kind of block generations. They're going to be of varying sizes between our current Delphi and our next generation vehicle. And so we will definitely have variable buses that we're flying based on customer requirements and customer missions for whatever they actually need. So just like Delta Airlines has multiple aircraft that are of different generations that they're flying that are satisfying their customers' needs. Think about it in the same way with our fleet of satellites.
Very interesting. So we've spoken about a bunch of different things. One thing that I'd love to sort of understand. So going back to the overall cumulative life expectancy of the satellites that you're building on, designing towards 15 years cumulative on orbit operations or 15 re-entry cycles, whichever comes first. How do you sort of envision that variance? Or are you sort of expecting the standard to be sort of like 3 5-year or 5 3-year cycles per vehicle? Or are you expecting there to be a wild variance? 1 10-year mission and then a dozen month-long missions, so to speak.
Yeah. So I would look at it from the fleet's perspective and from our customers' perspective, not necessarily from the vehicle. Like that's on our responsibility to optimize the lifetimes for kind of each vehicle. But the amazing thing that a reusable satellite can offer is you now have a knob or a design variable on mission duration that didn't previously exist from an economic standpoint. So we can actually allow people to design a mission that is, say, 1 month or 6 months or 12 months or 3 years. So that is a whole new mission architecture class that giving that variability really opens up a lot of doors. So what people are going to do with it and where that focus is going to be and where the most demand is, we can't answer. We just are really excited about opening up the market um, to those new architectures, and then we'll kind of see where the demand falls.
So you're sort of answering the question behind the question, which was, I mean, as you're creating these new mission types that are now available to the public, you're effectively creating new markets,
Yeah,
missions
correct.
that simply could not be done previously. And so it sounds like, hey, we don't exactly know what that demand curve is going to look like for total duration of mission, but we're
Yep.
ready and able to sort of address whatever that demand curve looks like over the course of our entire fleet, which is awesome. It's super cool. One of the other trends that we've seen is that and you alluded to it earlier a little bit, but mentioning how sort of the payloads for a lot of these satellites that are currently going up, the payload progression or innovation in that payload space has largely sort of matched the cycle time for those missions going up. So it's more the payloads have developed at a rate consistent with, okay, well, we'll get our next batch of satellites going up 3 years from now. So we have that time to sort of improve that. And sort of the corollary question, as you're now able to, one customer would be able to potentially get a different satellite and make upgrades to it and continue to do so on, let's just say, a weekly basis. How are you sort of envisioning that playing out into the broader space market? Like, I would imagine absolutely that the innovation and progress we see in payload is going to quickly sort of catch up to the ability to meet that cycle time and to get a bird back up with the upgraded camera or the upgraded sensor.
Yeah, exactly. I think we that is something we want to enable on the payload innovation side. So knowing exactly what people are going to do with that, how often they're going to want to upgrade things, again, we don't know the exact answer there, but there is precedent for this in the past. So when the price dropped and the cadence went up and the schedule reliability of launch went up due to Falcon 9's rideshare and that was possible due to Falcon 9 reusability. We saw this explosion in satellite companies, right? We're a result of it. Tons and tons of companies that we're all very familiar with were possible because rideshare became this very consistent, trusted, well understood, well priced offering to the market. And so if you translate that from the rocket to the satellite, you can imagine and transpose to see the innovation in the payload layer. And that's something that we want to do as we drop that price and we increase the trust and the reliability and the supply chain resiliency of satellites. We really see the payloads expanding greatly.
Nice, nice. So I've got another sort of handful of questions here that boil down more to sort of the unit economics and the sort of the revenue model of your satellite and your fleet and your missions overall. But so there's going to be some level of high fixed costs in order to actually build the satellite from scratch, and then the refurbishment costs in orders of magnitude lower, sort of marginal cost. I mean, and you already sort of alluded to the fact that there's some question marks as to what that total requirement for refurbishment will look like. Will it just be, hey, everything is hunky dory? It's just the ablative layer that we need to go back and put on, and we just need to replace the heat shield? Or is there going to be more hardware that we need to actually replace and reinstall? I would imagine that for the most part, the total amount of hardware that you need to restore winds up being a pretty low marginal cost that you'll be, the hardware is going to cost $1. The expensive part here is actually recovering and getting the asset back from orbit. But tell me a little bit more about sort of what the marginal cost you're envisioning for a refurbishment is relative to the total cost of the satellite and the launch.
Sure, I can talk to that a little bit, but we haven't released specific numbers against that. So we'll kind of have to keep it a little bit top level. I think the way to think about it is that we are taking advantage of lower launch cost. And when you do that, you are less sensitive to mass optimization. The reason that satellites are attritable and that they're so unique is to save mass at all costs. And that's because launch has been so expensive for so long. There is an inflection point as launch price approaches zero where it makes sense to take up more mass in order to have reentry and reusability capability, right? So the napkin math that we have to do and that we convince ourselves that this works is that we're not so heavy that it costs so much more to launch the vehicle than the savings you're going to get on the satellite side. One of the arguments that people say is, satellites are getting so easy, we can make them so cheap that we'll just, throw up more satellites and let those go until 5 years, and we don't care because they're so cheap. We built, I think collectively, we built somewhere on the order of 5 to 7,000 satellites last year. That is orders of magnitude less than cars and consumer electronics, right? Like those things are real economies of scale. Satellites, even at some of the levels of these mega constellations on an annual basis, are not approaching automotive or consumer electronics. So we're not near the area of economies of scale where you get to just straight up material costs. And so when that happens, satellites are still exquisite and unique. It makes a lot of sense to make it a little bit heavier, a little bit more robust, in order to reuse it for a long time and not have to rebuild it from scratch for every mission. So that's the way that we really think about it when we compare against the attritable. I will say that we our current missions are drastically lower cost on a per bus, usage basis because we can amortize it. But without knowing exactly how many missions we can amortize that across,
Right.
that's a big, knob in the Excel spreadsheet for what those unit economics actually look like. So we definitely have projections, but it's up to us to, actually show that through execution.
Sure, sure. So you're able to do things more cost effectively because you're able to bring the satellite back, recover it, refurbish it, and get to 15 years of on orbit operation rather than just 5. So maybe that first sort of 5 years, if we are sticking to, just for simplicity here, 3 5 year cycles, we'll say. So maybe that first cycle winds up being at a more comparable price point, and then cycles 2 and 3 wind up your margin just expanding as the marginal cost there is so low. It
Yeah.
makes perfect sense.
Yep. Totally.
Is there some risk involved with like the timeline on collecting on those contracts, seeing as you might not get your full money back until a couple missions in? Is there also some benefit to like you own the bus, presumably, correct me if I'm wrong, and you can list that as basically an asset and increases the value the more you deploy? Like, can you talk about the kind of balance there?
Yeah, totally. So we will be a satellite operator of the satellites that we manufacture. So back to the aircraft analogy, we're essentially Boeing and Delta Airlines. And the reason for doing that is because we've designed such a fundamentally different satellite that we need to operate it in space differently. We have to cover the integration and we cover the recovery. It ends up being a small bit that some other satellite operator would cover. So we end up doing all of that. And then we offer, access time on orbit to our customers as a service. So when an asset from space will come back and can be repossessed by a bank, that's very different than every other satellite that's ever been built, where it can't be repossessed by the bank. So there's whole new financial instruments that we can use in financing. And without getting too deep into the financial engineering, there's really just new interesting business models that we can use to kind of cover the risk of that time that you mentioned of the payoff period for each asset.
I'm interested to dig in a bit more on the operations side because, as you mentioned, there is not much precedent for handing over a satellite. There has been in the past. There was like the We Star satellite back in 1986 that flew and then was retrieved 9 months later and reflown again in 6 years under China Sat 1 as they handed it over. So there is some examples of asset exchange, but it's
There's a
a very,
real
very, very long time
Yeah.
ago. So it'll definitely be interesting to play out how that plays out. The trend I'm seeing more recently is with leasing satellites. Like the Space Leasing International has been looking at micro geosats. Do you kind of see that model playing out with your sort of business?
Um, yeah, I don't have intimate knowledge about those deals specifically, so I can't talk to those. Um, but I can talk to the fact that our goal for our customers is to get rid of as much resistance as possible to giving them time on orbit, with or without access to the payload after it's done. So some of our customers will care about getting their payload back, like obviously in space manufacturing, and getting those materials back. And then there's other hosted payload, customers that will just want the data after 6 months in orbit or something like that. And so our goal is to provide the most robust and the most reliable infrastructure to them at the lowest cost. And the way that we see to do that is through this reusable infrastructure via reentry.
So I want to kind of hit on the heat shield aspect because you said you have to operate in a slightly different way. And just from a glance, the heat shield does seem to be one of the main differences between other satellites. It covers a whole side of your spacecraft, I
Yeah.
assume. That changes the geometry allowed for the spacecraft. Can you kind of talk to how that works? Because normally for me, it's like, well, that's where you put the thruster, that's where you put the radiator, and like you can't do big deployables like synthetic aperture radar. Is that all correct assumption? Can you talk through the limitations?
So yeah, I guess one correction there, we can do deployables. Just most of those big giant deployables aren't made to retract again and come back. So they would have to be jettisoned, which is fine for our mission architectures. So we can support those, and you just have a high reliability bus based on the reuse. So without going kind of too deep into how this is made, I think you're correct. We take half of the satellite and we cover it up with this big insulating heat shield. That changes how we do communications. That changes how we do sun pointing. That changes how we do thermal heat rejection and thermal management. It changes all the things about how we operate satellites in orbit. Our first mission next year, is going to be a demonstration of operating that vehicle in orbit differently than how all previous satellites have been operated. So, you know, all of our models show that those things all work with orbital mechanics, but we definitely have to do those things differently. So we have to do heat rejection out of one side, and it's the same side that we're doing our mission operations out of. We have to do sun pointing in a certain way and have enough battery power to cover if we're not going to be sun pointing the entire time. So a couple different things there that change the operations, but nothing there that really impacts our capability to do a mission. It just changes how we operate the satellite.
And how big of an impact on the architecture is the reentry portion of your spacecraft? Like in terms of controlling the angle of attack as you're coming back into the atmosphere, or any sort of deceleration components needed to land?
Yeah, I mean, that's the main job of the heat shield. And so, as you can see from our website, that is the fundamental base part of our structure, is that we've used the heat shield. We're not another satellite and we slap a heat shield on there. The heat shield, the static rigid heat shield, is the structure of our bus. And so everything with how we design this, within the box of the requirements for the vehicle and the design criteria, dictates that we can do the load cases for launch, we can do the thermal cases on orbit, and we can do the thermal and vibration and static loading during reentry. So that drives how we've designed the vehicle, structurally, thermally, things like that.
Oh, it's very interesting.
Totally.
Nice. So, Brian, I want to jump back really briefly. So you'd mentioned previously that that what you're able to do at Lux Aeterna changes the paradigm from a financial services and a financial engineering point of view. A financier can now effectively recover an asset. It doesn't always go to zero. There is a sort of a loss scenario where there is still some value recovered, regardless of how much of that capital it actually is. And so I'm curious as to sort of what your strategic and competitive view is of, I'll say, the space finance industry as a whole. For example, SLI, do you view them and their business model as more complementary or competitive to what you're doing at Lux Aeterna? And then sort of the similar set of questions for the growing and sort of burgeoning space logistics industry.
Yeah, totally. So the space finance world, we absolutely see as a partner, and something that, we are bringing a new product to market that we think, like we said earlier, will create new markets, right? And that takes some really great partners in to figure out how to support that new market and the new product. So we definitely don't see those folks as competition. We definitely see them as partners to kind of help us, navigate and figure out, this new paradigm shift. We are absolutely an infrastructure layer to orbital logistics, both in space and from space. So those are definitely use cases that fit very well with the platform that we are building. And that's everything from in-orbit servicing, in-orbit repair, refueling, to orbital depots and, delivery from space to Earth. delivery all over the world is not part of our fundamental, architecture of the fleet itself. But it's definitely something that we can support for some of our customers, like defense customers specifically.
Very interesting. So one of the reasons why I personally really like Lux Aeterna so much is the very sort of like simple analogy. You're able to just point directly to the analog between the automotive industry. The used car market and the automotive industry is what actually drives the American automotive industry, not new stuff off the factory floor. And so I'd be surprised if you didn't have that sort of analog in mind. But how do you view sort of Lux Aeterna fitting into that sort of archetype and fitting into that pattern as the space and satellite industries continue to mature and really grow into their own?
From our perspective, in this point in time, we are laser focused on demonstrating our technology stack, demonstrating the economics of what we're building, and then scaling from there. I think there's a lot of knockdown effects, which to me would be the used satellite market for reusable satellites. And I will be extremely happy and cannot wait for when that is a discussion that is widely had within the satellite industry. But exactly how that will fall and what that will look like from kind of a capital markets and a company structures. Is that something that we manage and are involved with? Is that something that there's new companies of used car salesmen or used satellite salesmen that do that? Can't quite comment on that, but I'm really excited for that future when that happens. We got to get the technology stack working and robust and trusted between now and then.
Very nice.
Very cool. So I was wondering about the fact that there are other reusable satellites, but not so much reusable satellites as much as reusable spacecraft. So trying to kind of delineate between the two things. You've got the X-37B, you've got Varda's Winnebago, you've got Dragon. These are heat shielded vehicles that can come down and refly.
Yep.
What do you kind of see as the difference, and what do you think keeps them from? You prove the market exists. What keeps them from going, oh, there's money to be made here, and just using their spacecraft for that purpose?
The ones that you mentioned are pretty well focused on down mass and bringing things down. They're not necessarily fundamentally designed for the entire vehicle to be reusable. I think X-37B is one that is similar to the space shuttle. It takes a lot of refurbishment and a lot of inspection in between each flight. They're not very public on X-37B, but we were very familiar with what happened on Space Shuttle. The fundamental difference for us is that everything comes back, and the vehicle does satellite missions while it's in space. So the non-heat shield side, the backside, looks and feels and acts like a satellite in space. That makes it have a much lower barrier of entry to payload developers and payload operators. And so, it looks and feels and acts like a satellite in space, and then comes back where everything comes back, including the solar array and things like that. So, there are vehicles like X-37B that come back. A lot of the other down mass capabilities, leave something in space, whether it's prop system, avionics, solar array, things like that. So don't really get to take advantage of the full reusability and supply chain resiliency that you get out of that. Now, are we worried about that competition? Our vision is that in the future, almost all satellites, except for giant mega constellations, will be reusable. So we do expect the entire market to follow our lead towards reusability, and we have no qualm with that. We welcome everybody to the reusable party.
Yeah, I mean, I like that kind of outcome as well. I like when people can work together to build the space industry as a whole, and I love that you're leading the charge on this because I also think it's a great idea. And to your point of like the fact that you are Boeing and you are Delta, like I think that kind of also amplifies your point of like you can be an operator and have more manufacturers come in. But the next question I want to ask is more like, do you also see yourself as the airport? Because there's a part of your operations where you have to land, At this point, we really only have the Malbuska landing port, or sorry, the Kuniba landing base in Australia, and I think the Maltruska one's supposed to come online soon. So, are you planning to use those? Are you planning to use water landings and retrieval there? Like, what's your kind of goal for retrieval?
Yeah, there's a lot of possibilities for landings. Southern Launch in Australia is a great partner. We're really excited to partner with them. There are other possibilities, both in the continental U.S., like you said, land versus water, and other places in the world. We chose the lowest risk and the best fit for our very first mission. But we're definitely looking at other landing sites. To your analogy, I don't think that we would be the airport itself, the landing reentry site. I think that we would definitely partner with them, like Delta or United have hangars at the airport where they do their maintenance. We will do refurbishment and physical work on our vehicles and our payloads at the reentry site. And so we would partner with them. But usually that's well suited for almost a municipality or state actor or something like that that can deal with all the permitting that goes along with it, things like that. So we see them reentry sites as a critical partner, but not something that we would necessarily vertically integrate on right now.
And do you see any challenges that you'll have to overcome there logistically, given that, one's in Australia, one's in Spain, they're not very close to your US base?
Yeah. Initially, we don't see challenges with that. What we want is low friction in terms of the reentry licensing, the site clearance, the logistics to go pick up our satellite and where we can host, our team to facilitate getting the satellite, things like that. We're not necessarily doing quick turn operations right now to say that we need to take this satellite and land it and launch it in 12 hours. We will get there in the future, and we will need new reentry site infrastructure to support that. But that's not really the focus right now. So that's kind of a tomorrow problem that we're definitely looking at, but not something that we have to take action on right now.
Great. Well, Brian, I know that your first launch of Delphi is coming up Q1 of 2027, and you are already overbooked. You're exceeding capacity and are in so much demand. So I'd love to better understand sort of what you're doing with the seed raise that you've done. A $10 million seed raise is a really healthy amount of money. So what's the goal for the next 6, 12, 18 months? What do you need to accomplish? What are the major milestones?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to comment on the, customers that are flying with us that, are trusting us for this very first mission, we're really excited to be partnering with them. And we're excited kind of in the next few months to release who that is that we're working with. Um, the seed raise gets us all the way through that first launch. So we are fully funded through the launch, orbital operations, and the reentry of that first flight. That was the key for this seed raise. We hit that, and so we're sitting very well to facilitate all the work that we have to do. Between now and that launch is a satellite build and test campaign. So this is something that in my previous lives I've done a lot of integration start. Slowly putting together the vehicle, testing it as you go, doing full up vehicle testing, vibration testing, TVAC testing, and then a whole bunch of software testing kind of right before you ship it, usually hours and minutes before you ship it. And then integrating that with the vehicle, the launch vehicle at SpaceX's facilities. As soon as we launch, we'll spend 3 months in orbit and then re-entry. So we're already, we're well underway on the FAA licensing that we have to do for that, and all the FCC licensing and things to support that mission. We are also planning for additional missions in 2027. And so we've got customers that we're talking to about flying on those missions later in 2027.
Awesome. And will the first Delphi be reused after that mission? Is that
Yeah, we do expect to do more missions with fresh vehicles before we do the first reuse. But yes, the first Delphi 1 will become Delphi 1R. So that will happen sometime after that first launch.
awesome? Well, I think you've thoroughly answered all our questions and gotten us excited for your upcoming milestones. But before we wrap up here, I just want to ask you, what do you need right now? What can our audience do to help Lux Aeterna?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are actively hiring. We've got a bunch of roles that are posted on our website. We're looking for people that are really amped about the mission that we're building, as well as folks that have hardware in space that is either working or you've been through a really fun failure analysis. You often learn more through a failure analysis than you do through a success on orbit, as a lot of us know. So if you've got hardware in space and you're excited about what we're working on, we'd love to hear from you. And yeah, check out our career site and join the fun.
Sounds great. Well, thanks again so much, Brian, for joining us on this episode of Space Times and telling us all about Lux Aeterna.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot for having me.